Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1021 Lilith vs. Fire Sorrow, a battle for past loves and present loves. After leaving the room where she had spent no more than a few minutes having a conversation with Xietain, Fire Sorrow's body slowly materialized at the top of the villa. While the strong winds of the world still stirred by the sudden evolution, Fire Sorrow's hair fluttered messily. But even that did nothing but increase the allure of her beauty. Despite being in a spot visible to all, no one noticed her, and all the soul evolvers or soldiers who passed by simply seemed to overlook her existence. Her pupils were dilated and her slightly narrowed eyes gleamed mostly with sadness amidst the joy and slight hope she felt in her heart. Yesterday is past and tomorrow is unknown. All we have is today and now. Fire Sorrow murmured with a bitter smile and laughed self-mockingly. Despite knowing it more clearly than anyone else, it is not so easy to ignore that which brought us to where we are today, and even more hard is not to be afraid of what might or might not be. Fire Sorrow remained staring at the turbulent sky filled with clouds of mana and purple lightning for almost a full hour before the cloud of confusion in her gaze began to gradually clear until she finally regained a sense of composure of her own. Just as Xietain had said, at least at the current time it was impossible to know whether he was the reincarnation of the heavenly wolf Sirius or not. Forget Fire Sorrow, even if Lucifer was present he wouldn't be able to know for sure since there was no one in the universe capable of seeing souls, and even if there ever was such a one Fire Sorrow doubted they were alive to compare Xietan's soul with the past Sirius. However, the connection between the two beings was there. Fire Sorrow was sure of it. Even if Xietain was once Sirius, that is in the past. Fire Sorrow would be lying if she said she didn't feel sad when she uttered these words, but lying to oneself didn't make any sense. Therefore, she was honest with the truth and accepted it as it was. In the past, I did things which I can never undo or erase even if I regret it to this day. 3 pairs of raven black wings appeared behind Fire Sorrow, and as they spread wide her voice became increasingly firm. At least I think I can protect a young little guy. Whatever it takes, I won't let anyone use you or try to control you. Even if she was doing this in part to forgive herself partially, Fire Sorrow was fine with that if she could at least lighten some of the burdens she had been living with for so long. Lilith had spent 2 days in Cram World to recover to about 80% before leaving. Although things for the demonic army weren't looking particularly good, they weren't in a bad spot either, and the other factions of higher existences who had expected to see the faction weakening greatly were taken by a not-so-pleasant surprise when they found out that despite having lost many soul evolvers, it had actually been less than 7% of the total. Considering that this had been the worst war the universe had ever suffered against the invaders of the Golden Domain, the loss of less than 10% of the total forces of the demonic army was more than a simple victory. One needed to know that losing between 6% and 10% of the army brought into battle against the invaders was the most normal thing in the world to the point where everyone had accepted it as a rule impossible to avoid. Therefore, when the news that the demonic army had not even lost 10% of the higher existences who had fought in the bloodiest war between defenders and attackers ever recorded, large waves rose up and tried to shake the faction of Lucifer. However, the members of the demonic army were fierce by nature, and although most of them had yet to recover, they responded with sharp teeth. The one who surprised everyone the most was Lucia, who for the first time showed anger and single-handedly managed to face the leader of immortal bloodlust for almost a whole day. Had it not been for the fact that everyone decided to step back after seeing that the demonic army turned out to be more powerful than it seemed, things would not have ended well at all. Of course, not everyone participated in this little battle among factions. No core members of the Army of Heaven or Endless Crimson Flame joined in the fun this time. When Lethar, leader of the Heavenly Moon Army, asked Lucifer how they had accomplished such a thing, the leader of the demonic army who was furious pointed at his face in front of everyone and told him to fuck his mother before leaving without anyone daring to bother him. The fact that it was Lilith who changed the fate of the war did not come to light, and she did not stick around to play with the other factions either, as at the first opportunity she left without further ado straight to the place she now considered home. It felt good to have a place to return to. A place where there were people waiting for her return. It felt really warm to know that there were people who actually cared about her as a living being and not about her strength or identity as one of the generals of the demonic army. With her heart feeling anxious to see mainly Xietain and Shirlin again, Lilith did not spare the use of mana and jumped through space as far as possible each time while pushing her speed to the limit. Approximately 30 hours later, Lilith entered the solar system, and with her heart pounding with excitement to see her loved ones again after more than 2 months, she continued her efforts to close the distance that separated them as fast as possible. Just when a small, bright, and beautiful blue dot finally appeared in her line of sight, Lilith's pupils twitched slightly as she saw a person standing in the void, motionless as if waiting there for a long time for her arrival. Slowly, Lilith reduced her speed, and as she saw the other party's expression, her eyes slowly began to grow cold as well. She stopped at a distance, not too large nor too short, and after a moment of silence, she calmly said, "Fire Sorrow, what are you doing in this place?" The other factions, Lilith. Being cut off without being able to finish her words, Lilith was a bit surprised, as Fire Sorrow was always very gentle, polite, and to a certain sense soft. This was the first time Lilith had seen such a pair of cold eyes in Fire Sorrow's face. Her eyes were so cold that they had practically narrowed into 2 slits, and the violet color of her eyes had become as intense as neon lights. "I need you to answer me one thing." Fire Sorrow spoke, and her voice did not convey emotion at all. She didn't wait for a response from Lilith and directly pushed her question to be answered. "Do you know a young man named Xietain?" Lilith's pupils contracted fiercely upon hearing this, and seeing the cold look in Fire Sorrow's eyes, she understood that something very big must have happened in her absence. "How do you know that name?" Lilith did not ask, but demanded. Her eyes had become as chilling as Fire Sorrow's, and unlike her, she did not hide her murderous intent. "I learned it from the person in question himself." Fire Sorrow waved her magic staff, and her body rose as her magical power began to grow out of control. "I don't know what you're planning, but your record with lower existences isn't particularly nice." The number of lower existences that fell under Lilith's charm was not small, and many of them unleashed wars that brought kingdoms to their doom because of her over the past decade. "That child told me that you two met when he was starting to evolve." A large yellow magic circle appeared in front of Fire Sorrow as her cold voice spread forward. "I don't know why you like to play with other people's feelings. I don't even know if you do it on purpose or not. But, you've targeted the wrong one this time." It was true that many lower existences who had fallen at Lilith's feet had killed amongst themselves while trying to prove their worth, but she was always indifferent regardless of how many died. Fire Sorrow couldn't care less about the life of a lower existence or 100,000 lower existences. She also didn't care if Lilith liked to make others into puppets of her own. "I definitely won't let you play with that person's heart." Fire Sorrow certainly wasn't thinking things through more thoroughly, or else she would realize that while her thinking was correct and she had enough reason to suspect Lilith badly, she was passing on an important fact. Arcane Fire Assault. Fire Sorrow waved her staff, and the magic circle in front of her spewed out a flare that roared like a dragon as it charged towards Lilith. Lilith's expression remained unchanged as she pointed forward and said in a cold voice, "Absolute zero." The entire area suddenly became covered in small glowing particles, and a kind of mist formed covering both Fire Sorrow and Lilith as well as the space between them. Fire Sorrow's arcane fire assault skill managed to resist against the low temperatures of the particles that stuck to its dragon form, even though its magical power gradually decreased more and more. In the end, Lilith was forced to increase her magical power outflow and invest more mana in order to nullify Fire Sorrow's magical attack. Bang! As expected. An attack of this level is not enough even though you are one order and so many levels below compared to me. Fire Sorrow watched as her flame dragon and Lilith's ice particles slowly disappeared as she coldly said, "Lilith, stay away from that child and stop using your charm on him. If you promise to do that, we can go back to the way we were before." Lilith thought she had a good idea why Fire Sorrow was behaving like this towards Xietain, and if she was right then that would be better since at least he wasn't in danger. It will be hard to bring her back to reality though. Lilith sighed and prepared to risk her life in this battle. "I hope my injury doesn't become too much of an obstacle." She would have to give it her all and more, or she would really die. Leaving Lucier aside, there were only 2 existences in the entire demonic army that Lilith wasn't confident she could defeat. One of them was Lucia, and the other was precisely Fire Sorrow in front of her. Imitate. Lilith's body became a blur, and in an instant, 2 of her appeared. Moreover, they both held a beautiful white sword with a crimson jewel in the center of the guard. "I guess your answer is no." Fire Sorrow smiled for the first time, but her smile was far from gentle or kind like it used to be. "That'll work for me too. Actually, it's better this way. I had planned to hit you a bit to knock some sense into you, but your last words don't seem particularly pleasant to me. The two Liliths spoke at the same time and in the same exact tone of voice. Could it be that you fell in love with my boy? Lilith's question had certainly touched a nerve in Fire Sorrow's heart. She did not love Xietain per se, but she loved who he possibly once was, and therefore cared very much for his well-being. Heh. Fire Sorrow waved her staff and said coolly, Starfire Blast. Ice Genesis, Lilith responded without missing a beat. Boom. And so began a terrifying battle that shook all the nearest stars and planets. One woman wanted to protect the one who was possibly her past love in the faint hope of maybe one day being happy, while the other simply wanted to make it clear that she was not playing around, nor was she bewitching the man in question. Present loves and past loves, along with a minor misunderstanding, was more than enough reason for two people who respected each other and were practically friends to fight to the death. How would it all end? Neither of them knew. Jealousy, mixed with deep feelings, such as love, often led to bad results. Regardless of the outcome, it was certain that many things would soon change. We have been in the top 1 GT for 10 months in a row, and it means a lot to me to see that my effort pays off. Many thanks to you, who still donate your golden tickets and support Blood Warlock. Love. Visit and read more novel to help us update chapter quickly. Thank you so much. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1022, Her Own Forgiveness and Conclusion in Sight. It had been 4 days since the Earth evolved, entering its third stage in just over a year's time. To say that everyone, or at least the more normal and weaker ones, hated the soul record was not an exaggeration at all. This hatred would only grow if Earth humans knew that other worlds took thousands of years to reach the third stage of evolution, but they were forced to adapt and grow to such a level in little more than a year and 3 months of time. As the saying goes, many times being ignorant of something was bliss in itself. 4 days ago, after Fire Sorrow left, Xietain stayed in his room for about 10 minutes, thinking about the conversation he had had with her. While it was true that Xietan's thoughts mainly lingered on the heavenly wolf Sirius and the love Fire Sorrow felt for him or had once felt for him, there were also times when Xietain couldn't help but remember the sorrowful look filled with expectation in those beautiful purple eyes. In the event that he really was the reincarnation of the heavenly wolf, and even though Xietain had no memory of his life as Sirius, Fire Sorrow had certainly been a person of importance in his life. Therefore, remembering that small spark of hope in the midst of so much sadness certainly came as something of a shock to him. It didn't feel particularly pleasant to be unable to remember a person who was most likely part of his past, and it didn't feel particularly good not knowing what complicated relationship the two of them had come to share. Fortunately for Xietain or not, this time he didn't have room to get lost in his thoughts and let his mind wander too much. Several minutes after Fire Sorrow left, Xietain stood up and began to help with the reorganization, as well as personally giving orders. It was around this time that Shirlin and Xiao Xiao, who had been helping to calm the troubled waters, approached him, and Xietain certainly showered them with affection as he strove to get everyone's lives back to normal as soon as possible. 2 days later, the first general report with a considerably close approximation of how many casualties the Transcendent Faction's population had suffered was handed to Xietan's table while he was sharing his lunch with Xiao Xiao, Shirlin, and Callie. 8 million dead. Xietain clenched the page in his hands tightly, and a pained expression crossed his face as he mumbled the number between his teeth. His Transcendent Faction barely had a little over 40.000.000 living beings, all of them divided into numerous bases in the different districts and sub-districts of China so that there was at least one base per district. 40.000.000 was not a particularly small number, but considering the colossal size of China, it was far from enough. Now that almost a quarter of that number had disappeared overnight, one could try to imagine how long it would take to recover. The loss of 8.000.000 lives was not as simple as losing numbers. There were many jobs that had been left empty, over 4 bases that had completely collapsed, observation stations and advance camps that needed to be replaced immediately, and many more things that would become clearer once the overall report became even more accurate. "Where is Luo Ning and the Wen twins?" Xietain asked, trying to maintain his composure as he set the folder aside. He no longer had the appetite to touch the delectable food in front of him. "Yes, reporting. Miss Luo Ning and the 2 Mrs. Wen Yun and Wen Yan are currently at the Shanghai base." "Shanghai?" Xietain was slightly surprised. "Yes, leader. The soul evolver in front of him nodded. Shanghai borders the Pacific Ocean, and an operation is currently being planned to recapture the nautical military base located there. If Bai Zemin was not mistaken, in that military base there should be some American ships. Could it be that maybe there were aircraft carriers with intercontinental missiles? He stood up and said in a deep voice, "Who is the person in charge?" "It's Miss Shangguan Bingshui." The soul evolver quickly explained, "She told me to inform you about it, leader, and that there was no need to worry too much. Other than second-in-command, Shangguan, General Feng Hong, General Liang Jing, and Miss Sun Ling are among the selected troops." "Good. I'm heading to Shanghai." Bai Zemin nodded and without delay delivered several orders. Before leaving, he left Kong Lan in charge of the base and also made the two Nangong siblings his loyal followers. Bai Sherlin, Callie, and Xiao Xiao entered the collector's pocket world while Bai Zemin climbed onto Little Snow's back and left for the mother fortress. Although Little Snow had entered the Third Order and in theory should be able to take on human form and speak, the reality turned out to be completely different. No matter how much Bai Zemin tried to engage her in conversation, Little Snow simply could not respond with human language even though she clearly understood perfectly what he was saying. She also didn't seem to be able to turn human, something that perplexed Bai Zemin and the others who believed that upon reaching the Third Order all mutant beasts were capable of doing so. After about 40 minutes of running through the sky at full speed, Little Snow took Bai Zemin to the mother fortress. He did not stay there long, and after using another of his now 5 free spaces to make Fu Xiefeng his loyal follower, he ordered Little Snow to run at full speed to the south of the kingdom. Shanghai was located in the south of China, while Inner Mongolia was in the north. Moreover, with the territory of the world in general growing exponentially, even at the wind speed Little Snow was moving at, it was not possible to get there in a matter of a few hours. As it turned out, by the time Bai Zemin got there it had already been almost 20 hours since the time of his departure. "Where are you guys?" Bai Zemin asked as he brought his right hand up to his mouth. 2 or 3 seconds later, Shangguan Bingshui's indifferent voice came out from the golden runes of the commander's ring. "We occupied the university. I'll be there shortly." The two had been in contact for the past few hours, so Bai Zemin now had a better idea of the situation. Arriving at what was once the prestigious Shanghai University, Bai Zemin was not surprised to find a pile of rubble and shattered buildings. There were also numerous soul evolvers tossing zombie corpses aside to later set them on fire. Leader Bai. My God, this is the first time I've seen him in person. Is that a dog? That dog is the leader's mount. It's a Third Order mutant beast. Third Order? Of course, Bai Zemin's arrival did not go unnoticed. Especially when the others saw him descend from the sky riding a giant white dog nearly 3 meters tall that was even bigger than a horse. He waved to those who greeted him and asked them to return to their business without paying too much attention to him before finally making his way to the single tent that had been erected in the center of the grounds within an area that had clearly been cleared in advance. When Bai Zemin stepped into the tent, he was immediately greeted by familiar faces. Leader, it's been a while, cough. 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 Amidst fierce coughs and his face growing redder and redder from lack of air, Liang Jing barely managed to speak with tear-filled eyes. It's a pleasure to see you again, cough. 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 The corner of Bai Zemin's mouth trembled like crazy as he looked at Liang Jing speechlessly. This dude was a Third Order level 115 soul evolver, and his power was not inferior to Fu Xiefeng's at all, being only surpassed by Evangeline, Shen Mei, and Kai Jingyi among all the assassins in the faction. Despite his level, however, Liang Jing looked so old and unhealthy that he seemed to have 1.5 feet in the grave. Had it not been for Bai Zemin and the others knowing that this was a peculiar trait of his class, everyone would have panicked thinking that instead of helping him live longer what evolution was doing was killing him and taking away his lifespan. Liang Jing, it's good to see you are still as healthy as ever. Bai Zemin winced as he said those words. Liang Jing was coughing fiercely, unable to speak, so he waved his hand as a sign. Soon, Bai Zemin's eyes landed on Feng Hong and his expression became serious. However, before he could say anything, Feng Hong beat him to it. Leader, you don't need to say much regarding my daughter. Feng Hong shook his head and sighed. To be honest, it wasn't until 3 months ago that I found out about your past relationship with Tian Wu. She may have always kept herself indifferent and cold on the outside, But how could I as a father not notice the frown that appeared more and more often on her face every time someone mentioned you? Shangguan Bingshui and Sun Ling were the only two adults present in the place, and upon hearing the words, past relationship, both immediately focused their attention. No one knew for sure, but it wasn't hard for the more attentive to notice that Feng Tianwu and Bai Zemin definitely knew each other from before, and since Bai Zemin always kept her at a certain distance, it wasn't hard to assume that whatever past the two shared was not particularly pleasant. However, no one asked anything about it, and even Shangguan Bingshui, who was one of the people closest to Bai Zemin, was only now learning the truth. Feng Hong continued, I know you have already forgiven my daughter, but that girl still blames herself for what she did in the past. I'm sure she did what she did this time, to try to break out of that guilt that torments her heart, so none of this is your fault. Hearing Feng Hong's words, Bai Zemin could not help but sigh in his heart. Feng Tianwu's state was currently too miserable. He had visited her 3 times in the past few days, but even with his fire resistance being almost 30%, he could barely be around her for a few minutes before he was forced to retreat from the ice chamber. According to Callie, she estimated that Feng Tianwu would probably die within a month at the latest. The past is in the past, and although it is impossible to forget, I have truly forgiven Feng Tianwu for what she did back then. I have forgiven her, but perhaps she needs to find her own forgiveness. Bai Zemin sighed. A moment later, his expression turned serious, and as he looked at Feng Hong he assured him, I will do everything within my power, even risk my life to find a way to help Feng Tianwu get out of her current situation. She is a cherished warrior of my faction willing to fight to the death for me, so it is the least I can do. Feng Hong bowed his head in silence and remained so for several seconds to express his gratitude. Shangguan Bingshui and Sun Lin, on the other hand, looked at Bai Zemin. Although it had not been said out loud, the two women were smart and on their own were able to judge that the relationship between Bai Zemin and Feng Tianwu was more than just friends, but things had probably not ended well. At the same time that Bai Zemin arrived in Shanghai, the battle between Lilith and Fire Sorrow that had been going on in outer space was finally coming to a conclusion after almost 2 days. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1023, End of the Battle, Nibelheim vs. Fire Sorrow Domain. The explosions echoed and shook a part of outer space within the solar system for almost 2 whole days. At the same time as the clash of magical attacks caused extremely bright flashes of light, sword flashes occasionally joined the fray from one of the sides, causing whistling sounds before finally culminating in a loud boom after colliding with the other side's magical attack. Boom. After a final thunderous clash, Lilith's feet slid across the void hundreds of meters at the same time as her sword was finally sent flying after enduring for so long. At the same time, Fire Sorrow grimaced as her body slid backwards, and it wasn't until after almost 500 meters that she managed to stabilize herself with a strong flapping of her 3 pairs of wings. The two women looked at each other in silence for a few seconds, both breathing heavily and neither of them exactly intact. Lilith's face was deathly pale and the gleam in her eyes was slightly dull. She tried to move, but an involuntary grunt escaped from between her lips, and as she looked down she saw that the injury to her chest had opened up again. Although her life was not in danger, her current situation was far from optimal. Looks like this is as far as you go, bloody succubus Lilith. Fire Sorrow panted, and although her body was riddled with cuts and covered by various layers of frost, the expression on her face was very calm. In fact, the major difference between the two women was just too obvious. How much mana do you have? I'm pretty sure you've used more than me. Lilith asked as she used her right hand to cover her chest while using the same skill she had used in the past to heal herself. Heh. My physical capabilities are certainly nothing compared to yours. Not for nothing did you manage to cut me several times with your sword. Fire Sorrow sneered. The pride in her voice was evident as she confidently said, but when it comes to mana and magic I don't think there is anyone with better conditions than mine. Fire Sorrow was deservedly the existence known as the most talented mage in the universe. Even Lilith, whose magic and mana stats were surprisingly high, was close to hitting rock bottom after casting her most powerful magic skills without rest for so long, but Fire Sorrow seemed to be ready to fight for another 2 days without any problems. Fire Sorrow, why don't you think things through more carefully? Lilith sighed, and even though she seemed to be at a total disadvantage, her expression was very calm. Bai Zemin and I are a real couple, man and woman sharing heartfelt feelings. I'm sure someone like you could easily figure that out, couldn't you? Didn't you catch my scent on him? Fire Sorrow frowned slightly upon hearing this, because after fighting Lilith for so many hours and receiving several wounds she slowly began to think and remember things more clearly. However, emotions were really a double-edged sword, especially for someone like Fire Sorrow who was desperate to hold on to the small glimmer of light that had finally appeared in her life after millions of years of darkness. "You seem pretty calm?" Fire Sorrow chuckled, and at the same time as a weird flash of light shone in her eyes her aura began to increase exponentially at the same time as tiny sparks of crimson fire danced around her. "Lilith, do you really want to throw your life away like this? Promise not to get close to Xietain, and let's stop here." Lilith knew what was about to happen, but even then she didn't lose her cool, and as her body was bathed in the warm green glow that was healing her from deep within she said casually, "Are you sure you're doing this because you think I'm using my charm to affect Xietan's mind?" "What do you mean?" Fire Sorrow frowned slightly, but still smiled faintly. Lilith's lips curved slightly into a smirk, and she pointed out, "Fire Sorrow, you're jealous, aren't you?" "Jealous?" Fire Sorrow was surprised before bursting out in laughter. "Lilith, do you really think an old woman like me can be driven by something like jealousy? Xietain is indeed outstanding, more than any other stock I've known in the past. But, he's just a child who's not even half a century old. So what with that?" Lilith snorted. "Just like you and me, Xietain is destined to live forever. 100 years or 40 million years makes no difference when it comes to eternity." "I concede that you're right." Fire Sorrow smiled and nodded before shaking her head, "But do you really think I would be jealous of a young man I talked to for less than 10 minutes? That child is indeed charming, but do you think that for someone who has spent millions of years next to one of the most handsome men in the universe that's enough?" "Certainly. It is true that Xietan's charm is not enough to affect or surprise you. It is also true that his appearance is not much if you compare him to beings like Lucifer, Medes, or the other leaders." Lilith nodded calmly. "However, Fire Sorrow, what about what is hidden in Xietan's soul? Does it not appeal to you?" The slight smile on Fire Sorrow's face receded a bit, and seeing this Lilith continued, "I don't know what your relationship with Sirius was, but you certainly loved him. Bloody succubus, do not speak of what you do not know," Fire Sorrow warned. However, Lilith ignored Fire Sorrow's warning and pushed her further. "No, forget that last word. You didn't love the heavenly wolf, but even today, millions of years later, you love him. Am I wrong?" Silence. Fire Sorrow warned, this time in a colder voice than before. "I don't understand what could have happened to make you live with regret for millions of years." Lilith seemed to be talking to herself as she looked at Fire Sorrow blankly. "You betrayed the heavenly wolf? Maybe he rejected you? Lilith, do you want to die so badly?" Fire Sorrow began to tremble, as did her voice, but slowly began to smile as her jaw tightened. "Or could it be that you rejected him?" Lilith's eyes sparkled. "If that's the case, then it makes sense." "Sorrow, regret over a choice perhaps?" He. "Very well. Let me show you then, that sorrows can turn into ashes in the fire domain." Bang! A bright blood-colored flame burst out completely, covering Fire Sorrow's body and causing the color of her hair to turn crimson as it spread everywhere. Lilith could feel death looming over her, and this time it was in no way inferior to when the Golden Domain's wrinkled old man ambushed her. Really, what a terrifying domain. Lilith's expression was cold as she opened her mouth and called out just as the crimson flames were an inch away from enveloping her body, "Niflheim." Bang! A thick and terrifying amount of frost as black as obsidian burst outward with Lilith's body as the center, and in an instant, covered a large part of the area extending for miles in the blink of an eye. Fire Sorrow's pupils contracted to the size of a needle and her entire body trembled as she recognized that obsidian-colored ice frost. Ice-type firmament fragment. Fire Sorrow's eyes widened. She watched as her red devouring soul flame was quickly suppressed, and at the same time as she expended practically all of her mana to boost the power of her domain she exclaimed, "The one who buried all those angels from the army of heaven and locked Petra world in a prison of everlasting ice was you." Although Fire Sorrow knew about Lucifer's suspicions about Lilith, she did not share them and never for a moment thought that Lilith was the one truly responsible. She now realized that not only was Lucifer right all this time, but that she had been underestimating the woman in front of her too much. Fire Sorrow's magical power was certainly terrifying, and her mana was even more so. However, the power Lilith was using was part of a being that transcended the boundaries of the universe just like the heavenly wolf Sirius. the ice goddess Xietain might not be as popular as the heavenly wolf Sirius, but her power to annihilate entire armies and bury them eternally under layers of unbreakable ice was absolutely unquestionable. Ugh. Fire Sorrow tried to back away as she realized that Lilith's magical power now surpassed her own, but she quickly realized that all her surroundings had frozen over. Her violet eyes met the ruby-colored eyes of Lilith, who was staring at her from a distance, coldly, and less than a second later, her body was swept away by the obsidian-colored frost until she was turned into an ice statue. Fire Sorrow, I admit that with my current power I can't beat you. The two pairs of wings behind Lilith shimmered, and she became a flash of light. Swoosh! Her sword that had been sent flying somewhere suddenly returned to her hand as Lilith continued her advance towards the ice statue. But, this time victory is mine. Boom! The obsidian-colored ice imprisoning Fire Sorrow suddenly exploded into millions of pieces and her body surrounded by red flames recovered freedom. At the end of the day, the power of Nibelheim could imprison everything in an eternal ice prison under the Seventh Order, and Fire Sorrow was an extremely powerful Seventh Order soul evolver. However, Lilith not only had a part of the ice goddess Xietain's power. She also had the power of her beloved even though he was not with her. This was not about the power of friendship, nor was it about absurd fantasies. Lilith really held the power that Xietain had gifted her, and this would be the second time he would save her life. Fire Sorrow had barely regained her freedom when she saw Lilith a blink away, and just as she was about to activate a skill her pupils trembled as she looked at the legend-grade feather earring in Lilith's ear. Just a split second before her entire world was stopped by the effect of the absolute frozen domain, Fire Sorrow caught up to hear the last words Lilith uttered. Because you're fighting alone, but I'm not. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1024, Leviathan. Time for Fire Sorrow only stopped for half a second, an insignificant amount of time for someone who had lived millions of years and seen the end and beginning of countless eras as well as the fall of nations and the rise of others. However, that half a second could only be ignored when fighting someone much weaker. It certainly could not be ignored when she was facing one of the generals of the demonic army. When Fire Sorrow's senses returned to her, the first thing she felt was surprise since just before falling prey to the effect of the absolute frozen domain she expected to never feel or see anything ever again. Soon, however, Fire Sorrow heard Lilith's voice as her vision cleared. Fire Sorrow, if this was me from a year ago, you definitely wouldn't be alive. Fire Sorrow focused her eyes on Lilith who was staring at her from 2 arms length away with her sword half an inch short of her throat and made no attempt to move or continue attacking. First of all, she simply wouldn't be able to move her mana and activate any skill faster than Lilith could move half an inch forward and pierce her throat. And second but not least, the fact that Lilith didn't kill her, despite everything that had happened made Fire Sorrow slowly start to calm down a bit. But, Xietain really changed me. Lilith forced a smile and slowly put down her sword as she said with a sigh, I know he might be the reincarnation of the heavenly wolf Sirius. I also understand that this is the reason why you who were always indifferent to the lives of others and never mixed with lower existences suddenly decided to protect one. Even though Lilith had lowered her sword and Fire Sorrow was free, she did not attack nor did she try to put distance between the two. Now that her negative emotions had been burned away by her domain, Fire Sorrow could think things through more clearly. I really fell in love with him, is that so hard to believe? Lilith shook her head as a bitter smile crossed her face. Well, looking back at my past, I guess it really is hard to believe. Why didn't you kill me? Fire Sorrow frowned and asked, in confusion. A small part of it is because I feel grateful that you teach me magic, but now that we're square, I don't anymore. Lilith pointed out in an indifferent voice. Then her voice gained a bit of concern as she slowly said, but most of it is because Xietain might feel sad if he really is serious, and someday gets his memories back. Just as Xietain had told Shangwan Bingshui in the past when she was bent on killing her father, letting the emotions of the moment take over in situations that required making decisions of utmost importance was not very smart. At the end of the day, emotions affected logical reasoning, and they could lead people to make choices that in an eternity of time they might regret but never undo. Fire Sorrow fell silent and lowered his head to think for a moment. Lilith's last words showed her genuine concern for Xietain. It was impossible for Fire Sorrow not to notice. Fire Sorrow, come with me to Earth and see for yourself if I'm really affecting that little scoundrel's mind or heart. Lilith invited with an honest expression on her face, if it's you, I'm sure you have your ways of finding out if you really want to. Fire Sorrow's face flushed slightly embarrassed as she listened to Lilith's words, because only now was she realizing that she really had been ruled by emotions, especially jealousy. Perhaps, the thought that the person she had been in love with for millions of years being in a romantic relationship with someone else was less pleasant than Fire Sorrow suspected. But, that person is no longer that person. Even if that child was once him. Fire Sorrow closed her eyes as she sighed complicated emotions. A few seconds later, she looked at Lilith and said calmly, "All right, let's do as you suggest. But, let me warn you something first." Lilith looked at her silently, and Fire Sorrow continued, "If it turns out that you really are serious about your feelings, and are not affecting his heart and mind passively, then I will apologize to you and fulfill one request of yours, whichever one you want. However, if I find out that you are lying to me and using him, I will definitely kill you in the worst possible way." Just as Fire Sorrow said earlier, she was warning rather than threatening. Threats were for the weak and were used to try to instill fear in their opponents. On the other hand, warnings were promises that might or might not be kept, depending on the other party. Did Fire Sorrow have the power to carry out her promise in waiting? Lilith didn't doubt it at all. Then so be it. She nodded at the same time as she winced. Seeing this, Fire Sorrow sighed and took out a high-ranked general recovery potion. "Drink this. It will help a little." Lilith accepted the potion without compunction because she had already consumed all the ones she had before to speed up her recovery as much as possible. Hex of Greater Healing. The effect of the high-ranked general recovery potion along with Fire Sorrow's healing coupled with Lilith's extremely pure nature's wood-type energy-filled healing skill quickly increased the speed at which the damaged records recovered, and thus the latter's expression began to visibly improve at the same time as her mana recovered in real time. The two launched towards the blue planet in the distance, unhurriedly flying at normal speeds instead of jumping through space and get there as soon as possible. Lilith didn't want Xietain to see her in this state because she wanted to avoid worrying him, and Fire Sorrow didn't want him to have a bad impression of her. Fire Sorrow was certainly aware that she might have made a mistake and attacking the beloved person for whom she wanted to protect might not be a wise choice. But was it really possible to blame her entirely? She simply had too many reasons to think badly of Lilith, and even now she didn't trust her word 100%. That's how important Xietain had become to her at this point, or more precisely, the possibility that he was the soul of the heavenly wolf Sirius. "I'll pretend I'm fine, you use some magic on me so he doesn't find out about my poor condition." "That's fine with me too." "Heh. What are you laughing at? Keep acting confused if you want, but then don't come banging on my door crying. You remind me of a certain little ice princess who doesn't know what she wants." "Are you talking about the lower existence called Xietain Bingshui?" "Oh? I see you've already gotten to know the little brat. And I see that you seem to be not very fond of her." "Fond of that brat? Me? Stop joking. By the way, what's the deal with that firmament fragment? If what you want to know is if it was me who buried Petra World and all the Fifth Order angels there, then yes, it was me. But why? For some reason it seems that no higher existence can see Earth until now, but I think an angel saw it not long after the world began to evolve. I'm not quite sure myself, but I couldn't risk it." "I understand. If by any possibility they were to find out what that child is capable of, it could bring him no end of trouble in the future. That's just the way it is. So, if you want to report it to His Majesty, then go ahead, I don't mind. If the worst comes to the worst, I'll just quit the demonic army. It's not like I'm going to die of old age anyway." "That's probably what you're looking for, isn't it? Some kind of excuse to fly away from the nest and land in a different one. Who knows? You." As the two female higher existences who minutes ago had been fighting with their lives on the line for nearly 2 continuous days and launching extremely devastating attacks chatted friendly on their way to the now not-so-small bright blue planet. Preparations to retake the naval base on the coast of Shanghai that had once been part of the People's Liberation Army's Navy forces. There were more than 250,000 troops stationed there before the apocalypse broke out, so I think it is correct for us to assume that they have all become zombies if they are still alive. Xietain Bingshui pointed to the star mark on the map on the table. "But, weren't there more than 10 warships stationed there?" Feng Hong noticed immediately and didn't hesitate to expose everything he knew thanks to being part of a big family in the past. There was even a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, if I remember correctly. That's not to mention the military vehicles and heavy machine guns around the entire base. I think that's more than enough for at least a group of humans to survive. That might have been the case until a few days ago, but I'm afraid not anymore. Sun Ling sighed. She pointed to the waters on the map and said slowly, leaving aside the fact that even the strongest of past weapons have no effect against third-order mutant beasts except nuclear missiles. The sea creatures of the Pacific have practically taken over the base now. What the hell do those water monsters want? Feng Hong frowned tightly as he listened to Sun Ling's reasoning. Sun Ling shook her head to indicate that she had no idea. They probably want the power of warships? Bai Zemin casually commented, especially the power of the American aircraft carrier. That's... Sun Ling wanted to refute him, but found no valid reason to do so, and the more she thought about it the more it made sense. While it's true that warship power isn't of great use against third-order mutant beasts, they still can damage them a bit, and second-order ones would have to be careful. And a nuke missile could seriously injure a fourth-order powerhouse if the attack hits the target. Shangguan Bingshui nodded. She looked at Bai Zemin and said in a serious voice, "Our satellite caught an image 12 hours ago. Take a look for yourself." An image? Feng Hong and the others exchanged confused looks as this was the first time they heard of this. Except for Sun Ling, none of them seemed to be very clear on what was going on. Bai Zemin took the photograph that Shangguan Bingshui extended towards him, and although it was somewhat blurry and unclear as there were many waves and fog, there was something that was unmistakable right in the center. What the heck is this thing? Bai Zemin had seen all sorts of monsters since he came into contact with the mysterious soul record. From insects the size of a house to wyverns and dragonkins that were relatives of the legendary dragons and huge snakes that were almost a kilometer long. But this was the first time his eyes seemed to be looking at a real legendary monster. He looked at Shangguan Bingshui and said in amazement, "Is it just me, or does this thing look quite like the Leviathan of the Seas?" The Leviathan of the Seas was a mythological creature. The legend described it as a giant dragon-like monster that stretched for miles and swam in the deepest parts of the planet. It was also said to be one of the most powerful demons in hell as a reference to its extremely destructive power. I don't know if that thing is the real Leviathan or not, but it certainly looks too much like it. Shangguan Bingshui nodded. This thing is in the fourth order, no matter how you look at it. Bai Zemin muttered to himself as he looked at the image in his hands with narrowed eyes. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1025, The True Identity of the Zombie Leader. Riding on Little Snow's back at over 5,000 meters above sea level, Bai Zemin looked at the view below him and couldn't help but whistle in admiration. Those sea beasts sure are gambling big this time. On the ground, surrounding the entire naval base, what appeared to be tens of thousands if not hundreds of thousands of sea creatures were facing off against hundreds of thousands of uniformed zombies. Even more surprising. Those zombies are learning to use human weapons. Shangguan Bingshui pointed from behind him. Little Snow was very large, so she had no problem fitting several people on her back. MHM. Bai Zemin looked at the surroundings as he slowly said, "It's probably the work of whoever is leading them." Previously, the reason why the Transcendent faction did not attack this naval base was precisely because there was suspicion of nuclear weaponry on one of the ships. But now that Bai Zemin evolved into the Second Order, Shangguan Bingshui went ahead and planned everything to regain control of the naval base and take over the American aircraft carrier. She really was his best partner when it came to understanding what he needed and anticipating his future moves. On the ground, zombies dressed in military uniforms belonging to China's nautical forces raised their guns and opened fire on the countless crabs the size of a human face and lobsters the size of a table crawling seemingly with no end in sight towards them. The smaller caliber bullets simply bounced off as they struck the shells of the crabs and mutant lobsters. However, the medium and large caliber bullets took care of turning thousands of sea creatures per second into sieves. Even though thousands of crabs and mutant lobsters writhed on the ground shrieking in pain if they did not die immediately, their bloodshot-eyed comrades took it upon themselves to continue forward, and using the numerical advantage they had pressed the zombie troops back step by step. The pincers and tongs of the mutant lobsters and crabs were lethal weapons, and although these creatures were not particularly strong in general, their physical attack power and ability to penetrate armor were frighteningly high, even being comparable to those of level 30 soul evolvers. Fortunately for the low-level zombies, they did not know the meaning, let alone the feeling of pain. Although their legs were cut in half by the tongs and pincers of the sea beasts, The zombies that fell to the ground continued to pull the trigger of their weapons until they ran out of ammunition or until they were finally cut into dozens of pieces and killed after being tackled by dozens of crabs and lobsters. At the same time that the unclassified mutant creatures were fighting each other, the agility type and strength type first-order zombies were making use of their significantly more advanced bodies to take on giant black-scaled fish with 8 legs in a seemingly desperate attempt to stop their advance. The most terrifying were naturally the second-order zombies that already had enough intelligence to understand and speak a few words. A dozen second-order zombies with rustic swords and spears made of white bones activated potent skills as they faced off the more than 20 sharks and swordfish, all of them second-order with powerful physical abilities. Blood and flesh flew everywhere along with bone fragments and broken limbs, making not only the smell unpleasant but the sight even worse. The sound of gunfire along with attacks from the powerhouses on both sides echoed noisily for over 2 hours before the first major change on the battlefield finally occurred. In the sky. Look over there, they seem to be getting more serious now. Shangguan Bingshui leaned forward and extended her hand to point in the direction of the sea, but she seemed not to notice that her movement caused the front of her body to press on Bai Zemin's wide back. He didn't seem to notice either, or rather just ignored it as it was impossible not to feel the softness caressing the muscles under his shoulder blades. After what happened while playing Darkroom that day, many physical barriers seemed to have gotten a lot thinner between the two of them and now they no longer bothered about seemingly insignificant things. Bai Zemin narrowed his eyes and looked off into the distance, where 3 large waves rose practically at the same time, towering over 200 meters each. Soon, 3 third-order creatures revealed themselves, and when they appeared the zombies froze as if whoever was controlling it felt fear. One of them was a large sea snake over 700 meters long. The beast was covered in a thick layer of viscous liquid running over its blue scales, and it looked extremely intimidating with its giant teeth coated in fresh blood. The second sea beast turned out to be a blue-ringed octopus over 200 meters tall. The creature's tentacles resembled breathing as if alive as they repeatedly twitched and the blue-colored rings around its body glowed brightly in a particularly menacing manner. The third beast was a huge jellyfish over 500 meters tall. The beast was surrounded by thick armor of blue lightning, and behind it were at least 100,000 mutant jellyfish awaiting its command to advance and join the war on the mainland. As the 3 mutant third-order beasts appeared, Bai Zemin noticed that the leader of these zombie troops was clearly scared since for an instant it seemed as if the connection of the unknown leader with the zombie army was severed. Seeing him getting up on Little Snow's back, Shangguan Bingshui slightly moved backwards and asked, in puzzlement, "What are you doing?" "No, I think something is not right." Bai Zemin took out a rank 2 heavy chest plate from his storage ring and while equipping it quickly explained, "Bingshui, it seems that the leader is the only third-order zombie here. If that's the case, I'm afraid it will be impossible to stop that giant monster that was spotted by our satellite." Shangguan Bingshui's expression changed slightly upon hearing this as she soon understood what he meant. That means that if the zombie leader is cornered there is a possibility that it will fire 1 or even more nuclear missiles. That's how it is. Bai Zemin nodded. The terror of nuclear weapons was no longer their powerful detonation nor their terrifying shockwave. The real fear of Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui was in the radiation that would spread later and make it impossible to approach the affected area for at least 100 years. Even fourth-order soul evolvers could do nothing against the radiation that weakened and subsequently consumed records. Of course, a third or fourth-order soul evolver would not die from a few hours out in the open exposed radioactive zone, but they certainly could not stay long or they would begin to get weaker and weaker quickly. Suddenly, the giant sea snake lunged forward with its keen eyes fixed on the large central building that surprisingly was still standing even though the world had evolved repeatedly. Why doesn't the zombie leader fire the torpedoes and missiles from the warships? Bai Zemin was surprised as he watched the sea split in 2 and churned at the abrupt but fast movements of the sea creature. Just then, and as if responding to Bai Zemin, 3 whistles sounded from the distance, and in an instant 3 flashes of light shot out from one of the warships. It's opening fire. The speed of the giant sea snake was truly astonishing as it slithered through the water with agility, while the missiles were only slightly slower in comparison. The beast could clearly sense danger as at the first glimpse of the 3 missiles it opened its mouth and discharged 3 large green orbs. Boom! Boom! 2 of the missiles exploded immediately after being hit in mid-flight, but the third managed to continue its track only slightly disturbed by the superimposed shockwave of the 2 previous explosions. Boom! The giant sea snake let out a sharp hiss of pain and its head tilted back after being hit in the neck by the missile, and after the cloud of smoke was blown away by the strong winds, a car-sized hole was revealed just below the monster's mouth. Although the hole was insignificant compared to its large size, the pain the sea snake felt was evident by the sight of scorched flesh and red blood running between the broken scales. The giant sea snake was not stopped by the pain, quite the contrary. Its movement speed skyrocketed, and using the power of the giant waves to its advantage, it managed to counter the next shots coming from the shore. At this rate, it wouldn't take more than 5 seconds to close the total distance and reach the building. It was right at that moment when Bai Zemin's commander's ring lit up and Sun Ling's anxious voice rang out, "Bai Zemin, don't let that beast destroy the building. We have a change of situation here." Bai Zemin and Shangwan Bingshue's expressions changed noticeably when they heard Sun Ling's urgent tone of voice, and they both realized that there was no time to ask questions and wait for answers, as the sea snake was simply too fast. Bai Zemin knew that a normal attack would not be able to close the distance before the giant snake reached the shore, so without hesitation he struck at lightning speed the space in front of him 100 times. Void Fist. Void Fist was not Bai Zemin's most powerful skill in terms of damage, but it was certainly the one that traveled the fastest, as it literally seemed to cut space in two and avoid every obstacle until it reached its target. Rumble. The atmosphere rumbled, and just a second before the sea creature slammed its giant tail into the building, its body was sent flying backwards with blood and flesh splattering everywhere. Boom. The beast roared in pain as 1/4 of its tail was completely destroyed at the same time as it struck the water violently after flying over 2,000 meters, raising a huge wave that shook the surroundings mercilessly. The intervention of a third party was undoubtedly not foreseen by either the zombies or the sea beasts, as for a few seconds, the battle came to a pause, while each side assimilated what had just happened. "Sun Ling, report." Bai Zemin ordered in a deep voice, as this was not in their plans. "We made a mistake. There is no zombie leader at all." Sun Ling's voice sounded as surprised as Bai Zemin and Shangwan Bingshue were to hear her words. "What? That's impossible." Shangwan Bingshue approached Bai Zemin's ring and said in a cold voice, "If there is no zombie leader, then how can it be possible for those unintelligent zombies to be able to raise modern weapons and fight as a team? You'd better see for yourselves." Sun Ling seemed to sigh on the other side, and an instant later Bai Zemin felt that someone was trying to share an image directly to him from the black ring from which he could control all the communications of his faction. He accepted it without hesitation, and without delay, a holographic image shot forward from one of the golden runes of the commander's ring. What Bai Zemin and Shangwan Bingshue saw shocked them to the core of their bones, because if what they were thinking was true, then they had just found probably one of the greatest treasures that could exist in the entire world. With Sun Ling, Bai Shilin, and Luo Ning locking her in a triangle so that they could attack immediately if necessary, a very little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old was looking at them with her eyes as wide as spotlights and her body trembling like that of a scared little baby bunny. This little kid seems to have trouble with speech. It's probably the side effect of whatever it is she's seen and lived through all this time. But she's definitely human. As Bai Zemin and Shangwan Bingshue looked at each other in shock, Sun Ling sighed. The spiritual wave that controls the army of over 200,000 zombies is being released by this girl. She is the true leader of the zombie army. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1026, Bai Zemin Level 100 vs. 3rd Hell General Level 299, Part 1. Bai Zemin's group had planned to sneak into the building to ambush the zombie leader, and by killing it the zombies would immediately lose the only intelligent being who gave them orders, and could organize them as a real army. By accomplishing this, the Transcendent Faction's assault team would not have to worry about missiles from the warships, and could rest easy in the fact that the zombie leader would no longer have the capacity to launch a nuclear missile in the midst of his desperation. Those in charge of killing the zombie leader were Sun Ling, Bai Shilin, and Luo Ning. With the strength of these three ladies, even a level 180 to 190 soul evolver would succumb. On the other hand, while the three of them suppressed and took the life of the zombie leader, Wen Yun and Wen Yen would head to the midpoint between all the warships, focusing mainly on the American aircraft carrier with Liang Jiang acting as the guardian. This was because the twin sisters had a rather unusual class that made them very precious stocks for this particular type of circumstance. However, the fact that the zombie leader turned out to be a human, a little kid who appeared to be no more than 7 years old, was something that Bai Zemin and the others did not count on at all. Sun Ling, are you sure that the spiritual wave that controls the zombies is being released by that little kid? Bai Zemin asked in a deep voice. One needed to remember that apart from there being an army of over 200,000 zombies, there were also a dozen second-order zombies. Although a second-order powerhouse meant nothing in Bai Zemin's eyes as one slap was enough to make them explode into a bloody mist, this did not mean that they were insignificant. In fact, they were second to the third-order pillars that kept the faction standing. It's definitely this girl. Sun Ling's voice came from one of the commander's ring runes, and as Bai Zemin looked at the image of the girl trembling in fear with eyes filled with wariness and panic as she looked at the unknown people in front of her, he couldn't help but sigh. Life really is mysterious. He shook his head. Bai Zemin, we can't let that little girl fall into someone else's hands. Shangguan Bingshui frowned and said in a serious voice, her ability to control zombies is too dangerous. If someone with evil intentions somehow gets her trust through the use of sweet words, it would be a catastrophe for the whole world. I know. He nodded. Even though we managed to expel and kill the zombies from China practically for the most part, most of the world is overflowing with them. Besides, since the other party was just such a young girl, Bai Zemin doubted with all his heart that she could have any evil thoughts. She was probably just doing what she was doing out of fear and used what she could as her only method of defense to survive after experiencing who knows how many horrifying things for who knows how long. Wait, if the zombie leader is that girl, then how is it possible for her to know the workings of the warships and order them to fire? Bai Zemin suddenly pointed out. Hi, big brother, this is Wen Yun. A sweet and pleasant, but somewhat mischievous voice came from the commander's ring just at that moment. Yan and I are with Grandpa Jiang at the designated point. Can you see us? Bai Zemin looked toward a certain part of the base that was dangerously close to the shore, and amidst thousands of crabs and lobsters, he managed to faintly make out two little girls in a clearing made by enemy corpses. Cough. 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 Wen Yun, cough. 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 I am only 25. Cough. 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 That was Liang Jiang, who was currently swinging his dagger nonstop, wiping out hundreds of enemies per second with ease and not allowing the Wen twin sisters to be attacked. The Wen twins had very similar jobs, and although under normal circumstances they might not be very useful, the reality was that whenever the conditions presented, they could both become lethal war machines, especially when they were together. Both sisters were soul evolvers above level 70 at the moment, and while Wen Yan was able to control virtually any technology from the past, Wen Yan's ability was to control any heat weapon below the annihilation level. Wen Yan, was it you who fired those missiles? Bai Zemin asked in astonishment. Hee. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Wen Yan sounded excited despite the situation. Just at that moment, a deep and angry voice sounded from several kilometers further down the coast. Human King, stay back. This is a battle between my Sea clan and the zombie race. There is no room for your human race. The voice echoed and thundered like lightning, and as this being spoke, dozens of waves over 50 meters high rose up at the same time as a great pressure was released from the distance. Be big brother, dash. Ugh. Bai Zemin, it's that monster from the image. Leader, I can't move. Neither can I. Leader. The frightened and slightly pained voices of Bai Zemin's team rang out at the same time as Shangguan Bingshui's expression changed for the worse and her features turned slightly pale. That monster seems to be even stronger than Tao Ji, she said with concern as she inadvertently glanced at Bai Zemin, waiting to see his reaction. And I am far stronger than I was when I fought Tao Ji. Bai Zemin snorted coldly, and for the first time since he learned it activated shadow control. Shadow wings. At the same time as Bai Zemin's cold voice fell, his shadow that was projected on Little Snow's back suddenly twisted strangely, and under Shangguan Bingshui's wide eyes crawled across his legs, thighs, lower back, and finally stopped at the shoulder blade area. In less than 2 seconds, Bai Zemin's shadow had become a physical thing that could be touched. From both sides of his back, 2 ash-gray wings, each over 2 meters long, stretched out and opened wide to the sides. Little Snow, support Bingshui. Bingshui, I leave the orders to you. Taking control over the American carrier along with that girl are the highest priority right after your lives. Bai Zemin didn't wait for a reply, but at the same time as he jumped off Little Snow's back, he caught a hint of Shangguan Bingshui's worried voice. Be careful, make sure you get back at any cost. Again using shadow control, Xietain made the gray wings on his back give a powerful flap and his plummeting body suddenly gained momentum, shooting forward like a missile and reaching the shore in a jiffy. Hey, this is really impressive. Xietan's eyes flashed and his heart pounded as he looked at the world beneath his feet in awe. This was completely different from when he used the muscles in his body to create tremors that solidified steps of air around him. This was true flying. Although Xietain was relying on a skill to accomplish this, he was actually flying like a bird. Flying through the skies was always one of the greatest desires of every human being, but the most that could be achieved was using planes or zeppelins, never at the level of birds that could move with total freedom while feeling the wind howling in their ears and caressing their faces. Yet he was doing just that at this moment. The strangest thing of all was that in the past Xietain had tried to do the same thing with blood manipulation, but for some strange reason, it didn't work. The accumulated blood weighed too much to keep him in the sky floating, but his shadow didn't weigh at all. I don't care if you're king or if you're cub, you think you can simply order me to retreat from my own territory and do as you please? Although Xietan's voice was not loud, the power commanded by his tone, aura, and words was in no way inferior to that of the creature hidden in the depths far from the seashore. Retreat or die. Anyone who dares to invade my territory will be mercilessly slain. Rumble. Just Xietan's last bellow was enough to make the sea more than 4,000 meters below rumble, and the clouds in the sky exploded outward as if they were fleeing in fright. After a few seconds of silence, the angry but confident voice of the sea creature from before rang out again, this time much clearer and more imposing than before. Such arrogance. You're just a second-order soul evolver, but you dare to threaten me? Awesome, let the sea be your eternal resting place. Rumble. At the same time as the sea water began to churn more violently than ever and colossal-sized waves were rising uncontrollably everywhere, Xietain saw in the distance what appeared to be a wave that completely dwarfed the already terrifying waves that were forming near the shore and slamming into each other, creating terrifying bangs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. Xietan's expression turned into one of surprise when even after 5 seconds, the creature still did not reveal its full body, and the wave in the distance had already grown more than 2,000 meters high. Boom! Xietain quickly looked down as he heard a huge explosion, and amidst extremely hot yellow flames he spotted Feng Hong facing the terrifying electric jellyfish while the third-order sea beast's little brothers charged towards the mainland to fight against the zombies and human troops. On the other battlefield, Shangguan Bingshui riding Little Snow held the other two third-order sea beasts in check with relative ease, but it was clear that most of her focus was set on the distance as her eyes stared with growing shock at the yet-to-be-revealed beast. My God. God preserve us. Why Yun? Yin, don't cry. What is this creature? At the same time as large amounts of water finally fell back into the ocean in the form of waterfalls drawn back by the Earth's gravity, Xietain stared in amazement at what had to be the largest body he had ever seen in his entire life. Ignoring how much more was hidden beneath the ocean, the beast before Xietain towered by at least 5.000 meters into the sky. Its still wet body was covered by a thick armor of aqua-green scales, with terrifying spines on the sides and back that were as big as skyscrapers. Its wide-open mouth revealing sharp and extremely large teeth by itself was huge enough to devour the third-order sea snake that was about 1,000 meters long. The creature looked even more terrifying than a true dragon, and its appearance was at least 80% similar to that of the legendary Leviathan. Now that His Majesty has been released, I am free too. The beast's voice was a lot more powerful and clear now that he was on the surface, and just from hearing him speak Xietain felt his ears booming. My idea was to take this base only, but now changed my mind. The beast's green eyes glowed as it stared at Xietain, who was no different than a speck of dust compared to his massive size. I'll eat your records to start the day. The Leviathan's words sounded in the form of a roar, and despite the distance of at least 20 kilometers, Xietain could feel his body being pressed back as his hair flapped fiercely. This was by far the most powerful enemy Xietain had faced to date. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1027, Xietain Level 100 vs. 3rd Hell General Level 299, Part 2 Last. Eat my records? The wings behind Xietain opened wide, and with a single thought from him, they abruptly closed before immediately opening and repeating the same process. His body shot forward at explosive speed, and in an instant he was making use of every point of agility and strength to move faster than he would be able to on solid ground. "Let me see what kind of power you have to eat my records then." Xietain pointed forward, and from his fingertip shot out a tiny ball of deep blue fire. The giant Leviathan opened his mouth wide and his eyes glowed. An instant later, an extremely thick beam of bright sky blue energy rumbled and split space in two. From a distance, the energy beam fired by the Leviathan appeared to be something out of a fantasy movie due to its size, and it could even be seen from a distance of over 50 kilometers. The most surprising thing was that this giant energy beam suddenly seemed to meet an invisible wall in the middle of its path, because when it was 50% away from closing the distance and hitting Xietain, it just exploded. Boom! Bright flashes of lightning and blue flames flew everywhere while the raging sea shook as if a magnitude 10 earthquake was shaking the entire world. The waves resulting from the clash between the two magical attacks were so terrifying that they even hit the shore, affecting the other battlefields. Many sea creatures and zombies were crushed to death after being hit by the fierce tsunamis, but the humans were lucky to have Shangguan Bingshue's ice wall protecting their lives. Swoosh! Xietain broke through the cloud of chaos caused by the collision of the two attacks, and his body flashed as he charged straight towards the giant monster. The closer he got, the more he realized how massive the size of this monster was. Even more terrifying, however, was the fact that even after moving more than 20 kilometers deep into the ocean, he still did not reach the physical body of the beast. The size difference was simply immense. Overlap regeneration. At the same time as Xietain muttered to himself, the Leviathan seemed to let out a snort. The beast opened his mouth wide, and in less than a second, a new beam of energy even more powerful than the previous one rumbled as it flew towards Xietain with frightening accuracy. Xietain responded by striking over 500 times in less than a second, activating Void Fist in the direction of the enemy's magical attack. The two attacks met halfway again, and an explosion even louder than the previous one caused the waters to once again churn wildly. Rumble. The Leviathan seemed intent on attacking again, but his eyes widened in amazement as he saw right before him appear the young human who had previously been more than 5 kilometers distant. Replacing agility with strength this time, Xietain activated Gravity Manipulation X60 while fiercely punching downward. "Clench your teeth." Boom-boom. Boom. Like a meteorite falling from the atmosphere and under the disbelieving eyes of the human troops watching from the shore, the giant body of the Leviathan seemed to have been hit by a small golden bullet, and in an instant, his more than 5,000-meter figure was pushed straight down into the ocean. Rumble. Looking at the wave whose size was impossible to measure with the naked eye, creating a giant shadow that seemed to cover the world as it moved towards the shore, Shangguan Bingshue's face turned slightly pale. She extended both hands forward and urgently activated the full power of her Ice Maker skill. Freeze! Shangguan Bingshue could feel her mana rapidly diminishing, but she didn't care. Her beautiful blue eyes were fixed on the large wave at least 6,000 meters high that was slowly starting to slow down as it froze from the middle to the sides, up, and down. If that thing hit the shore with the force of momentum it carried, the result would be the disappearance of 1/4 of Shanghai City, and at least 90% of those present would have their bodies completely flattened. Roar! You ignorant brat, you have successfully pissed me off. Inside the only standing building, Sun Ling felt her world revolve, and for an instant, her vision went blank. The colossal beast's furious roar had been enough to leave Wu Yijuan's mother and Luo Ning, both third-order soul evolvers, stunned. If the people inside the building were affected, then those outside naturally suffered even more. The sea creatures collapsed, the Wen sisters directly fainted, and Liang Jiang lost his grip on his dagger as he staggered forward. Among the humans, only Shangguan Bingshue and Feng Hong, who had enough magic power to withstand the spiritual shock, stood their ground. In the building, Bai Shilin looked at Luo Ning worriedly, but the girl was smart and stared with her big black eyes fixedly at the little girl, who looked more and more frightened as she looked into deep water with wide eyes. Ah. Ah. The 7-year-old girl's mouth opened and closed as if she wanted to say something, but seemed to be having trouble doing so. In the distance, several miles away from the shoreline. Boom. The giant figure of the Leviathan emerged again, but this time with great fury. The beast did not stop, but with surprisingly high agility charged straight towards Xietain, who happened to be in the way. Bring it on! Xietain snorted, and instead of retreating he gave a loud flap with his head pointing downwards, and a moment before colliding with the rising beast he activated gravity manipulation X60 at the same time his left fist was covered by annihilation of the falling sky in the form of a dragon claw. Die. It only took a blink of an eye for the two to clash. Boom! The massive body of the Leviathan that had risen all the way back from the depths like a colossal dragon suddenly stopped in mid-elevation, and from a distance, the only thing that could be seen as an obstacle was a small golden glow, whose size was even smaller than the beast's smallest scale. Roar! The scales on the top of the Leviathan's head broke into pieces and sank inward. Fragments of red bloody flesh splattered everywhere, covering Xieitain's body and turning part of the water bright scarlet. At the same time as the creature involuntarily roared in pain and his body swayed, the ring-shaped shock wave spread outward and reached the shore at record speed. Bang! 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 Zombies and sea beasts alike exploded into pieces and their bodies soon turned into bloody mist after being hit by the shock wave, and even those who had already surpassed level 25 suffered horrible deaths. Seeing the shock wave completely visible to the naked eye approaching, Sun Ling's face turned terribly pale, and without hesitation, she grabbed Luo Ning, and as she ran towards the window she urgently shouted, "Little Sherlin, grab the little girl and leave the building." Bai Sherlin could sense the urgency in Sun Ling's voice and knew that she was a person close to her family, so she quickly did as she was asked. She ignored the girl's screams, and with a loud stomp, she smashed straight through the wall, crossing hundreds of meters in an instant, thanks to her monstrous physical strength. Not even a second later, the building was hit by the shockwave, and even though it had already been greatly weakened after traveling so many kilometers from the point of impact to the shore, it was still enough to smash half of the building with complete ease. Boom! In the sky, Shangguan Bingshua's face was pale as a sheet. She had just consumed 95% of her remaining mana to save everyone's lives, because if not for her the warhead missiles on the American carrier would have all exploded together after being hit by the shockwave. She stood on Little Snow's back and unsheathed Perfect Storm while shouting into the communicator in her left hand, "Surname Bai, are you insane? You have to get that monster away from here, or we'll all end up dead." More than 20 kilometers deep in the ocean, Bai Zemin's face was pale as a sheet as well while looking towards the shore with lingering fear. Just now. He did not expect something like this at all. Even he would have died like a miserable dog if several nuclear missiles exploded all together. Sorry. He hurriedly apologized and gritted his teeth as he glared at the giant Leviathan writhing all over the place. The sea was a mess, to say the least. God damn it, you turned out to be just a pure big mouth in the end. Bai Zemin cursed before diving down in search of his enemy. The Leviathan was in great pain, but the fury in his heart was as great as his physical body, and upon seeing his hated enemy charge towards him he immediately opened his mouth wide. Die. Dozens of bright sky blue energy beams not at all weaker than the previous two flew from inside the monster's wide-open mouth, taking Bai Zemin by surprise. Scram. Bai Zemin extended his right hand at the same time as he activated gravity manipulation in reverse to its full power. Although this did greatly weaken the power of the lightning-covered beams, it was not enough to stop them completely, and soon Bai Zemin was hit by several of them. His body was sent flying backwards more than 2 kilometers, and when he finally managed to stabilize himself with a fierce flapping he was not surprised to find that his chest plate had turned into a pile of waste. What surprised Bai Zemin was that even though he had some burns on his skin, it was still far from the damage he expected to receive, very far. It seems that my race evolution is not as simple as I thought. Feeling extremely proud and happy in his heart, annihilation of the falling sky turned into a spear and Bai Zemin dashed forward at full speed. What dash? Roared. The Leviathan's words were stuck in his throat and he had no time to voice his disbelief at the fact that a small human could take his magical attack with only mild burns, because just as the first word left his mouth a sharp pain from his right eye made him roar to the sky in agony. Blue flames blazed around Bai Zemin's body and kept away all matter that would have covered him after he turned the beast's right eye into mashed potatoes upon piercing it with his spear. And just as the creature roared he drew annihilation of the falling sky from the empty cavity and with a 360-degree spin struck the Leviathan with the back of the spear. Boom! The ferocious blow forced the creature back as his body bent backwards, but Bai Zemin did not stop and continued to attack with increasing ferocity. The Leviathan naturally did not allow himself to be hit silently, but even though his body was very heavy and Xietain could only force him backwards little by little, it was more than clear who had the upper hand between the two of them. From the shore, Sun Ling stared wide-eyed at the scene of an apocalyptic-sized monster, the most terrifying beast she had ever seen in her entire life, being beaten deeper and deeper into the ocean waters by a tiny golden, practically impossible to see from a distance. "This has got to be a joke," she muttered in shock. Boom. Boom. Rumble. Laser beams flew everywhere, shattering the skies. Dozens of them pierced the clouds per second. However, the mighty and seemingly invincible Leviathan with his imposing size and terrifying physical defense continued to be pressed deeper and deeper into the ocean until 20 minutes later he finally disappeared from everyone's line of sight, despite being a creature over 5,000 meters tall. Bai Shilin seemed to have forgotten about the little girl as she waved her fists in the air while hopping and clapping her hands happily. As for the little girl, she continued to stare wide-eyed at everything around her, especially the beams of bright azure light along with the golden flashes flickering in the distance, along with the constant rumbling of the atmosphere provoked by constant explosions. Although there were still giant waves rising beyond the horizon, by the time these waves reached the shore they had already weakened too much and therefore they were no longer a problem for the soul evolvers there. As for Xietain and his battle against the Leviathan. Boom boom. The beast's neck hit the turbulent waters heavily after being kicked directly in the jaw. Blood and flesh splashed everywhere, and one of the giant teeth flew out hundreds of feet before falling with a loud bang into the ocean. Xietain flapped his wings and backed off a bit to look at his enemy intently for the first time since he started beating him practically senseless, and the first thing he noticed was something that made him frown. How much health does this monster have? Xietain was sure that he had attacked at least 1.000.000 times during the past 40 minutes, but the Leviathan still looked considerably strong despite the fact that practically every scale on his body was either broken and bloodstained or with pieces of broken flesh stuck on his own spikes. Seeing that the creature was still struggling to stand upright again, Xietain snorted grumpily and waved his left hand outward. "You damn monster, I'm tired of playing with you." Swoosh. 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 Roar. The Leviathan roared in fury and pain as hundreds of huge blood chains coiled around his body. His own blood solidified into chains that not only restricted his movements, but also began to drain his mana, curtail his magical power, and as if that wasn't enough to cause him great pain as they were filled with thick, long thorns. "Just a little human. You're just a little human. Why? Why is your physical body so strong? Why can you break my Empyrean scales? Who the hell are you?" The Leviathan twisted and actually managed to crack the blood chains with his terrifying physical strength, but the chains used his own mana to strengthen and self-repair, so the addition of Xietan's mana and magical power made the beast experience his worst nightmare as he could not get his freedom back. Xietan's eyes were cold as he stared at the beast, wondering what to do next. "I see. You must be one of them. You must be one of those ants that oppose His Majesty's power, aren't you?" Ha 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 ha. Xietain had no idea what the Leviathan was saying, but he naturally deduced that he was probably referring to one of the 5 monsters of antiquity that he had to kill. "It's no use at all. His Majesty's power is absolute and there are still 2 above me who are more powerful." The Leviathan seemed to know what his fate would be, but he did not look sad or fearful. Kill me, and absorb my records. That way, I will become part of you, and I will see you die, and then be absorbed by His Majesty. You seem to be quite loyal." Xietain shook his head as he realized that he wouldn't be able to get any information at all out of there. Then let's save time. He had already made his decision, and although he would be sacrificing a lot of soul power, the reality was that right now, he mainly needed to strengthen his faction. Or else everything I built with so much effort will collapse like sandcastles. And Xietain could not afford such a thing. Under the subjugated Leviathan's one wide-open eye, Xietain flapped his wings and turned into a blur, reaching the beast's forehead in an instant. "Let go of me and fight. Do you dare?" The Leviathan writhed, and though his mouth was tightly sealed his voice still spread far and wide like a thunderclap on a hot summer's day. Xietain landed above the beast's mouth, at mid-eye level, and though the Leviathan was shaking hard he stood as firm as Mount Tai. "Sorry, but I have other plans for your records." What do you mean by that? Leviathan suddenly stopped all his struggling as he felt a bad premonition. You'll see. You'll see. Xietain muttered as he winced. You. The beast's left eye opened wide when he saw half of the left arm and part of the left leg of the young human standing on his head turn into pools of blood. You fought against me with your body incomplete? Xietain did not reply but silently activated Drain Life, and at the same time as he and the beast were surrounded by a halo of pale green light, the two felt completely different things. What? You're devouring my health directly to heal yourself? Bingo. Xietain whispered with his eyes closed before sighing. He could feel how the strong vitality of the Leviathan in conjunction with restoration and overlap regeneration increasing his health stat by another 7,700 points worked wonders on his body. The minor magical wounds and burns he had suffered earlier were healed within seconds, and 2 minutes later, Xietain opened his eyes again with an excited smile. This is really amazing. He clenched and closed his left fist, before looking at his fully regenerated left leg. I thought it would take me at least 2 or 3 more months in the collector's pocket world, but to think that I would come across a treasure like you. You bastard. Despite being much weaker and no longer having the same strength as before to struggle with such intensity, the Leviathan was surprisingly still well enough to curse. Don't worry. Xietain extended his right hand outward and a flash of blood-red light covered his entire arm up to his shoulder. I have something much bigger planned for someone like you. What are you doing? Stop. The Leviathan could definitely feel his deepest records tremble with fear as Xietain activated record devastation, and heeding that terror born from deep within his soul, the beast tried to break free using strength he didn't know he had left. Unfortunately, Xietain was in peak condition and all the wounds he had suffered earlier recovered 100% after using Drain Life. You couldn't present a real challenge before, do you really think you can do it now? Xietain scoffed and with a lightning-fast movement pierced through the monster's forehead easily. There was no blood, no bang, no break, and no wound. Xietan's arm enveloped by the blood-colored light simply pierced the Leviathan's body and sank like a stone causing ripples and disappearing into the bottom of the sea. No matter how hard the Leviathan struggled, all his efforts were futile and it wasn't long before the strength used to try to free himself began to plummet. High in the sky, invisible to all living things on Earth, 2 beautiful females with raven wings on their backs watched with wide eyes in shock at what was happening more than 100 kilometers away from the ocean shore. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1028, Soul Record and Record Devastation. After their battle to the death in which Lilith decided to leave Fire Sorrow alive and the latter came to realize that she might be wrong, both women headed straight to Earth and easily reached China once they passed through the atmosphere covered by a thick layer of mana. It wasn't too difficult for them to find Xietain, but Lilith couldn't believe what she was sensing. What's wrong? It seems as if you are feeling the aura of an unknown person and not the one you claim to love. That was what Fire Sorrow said at that moment when she noticed the surprise in Lilith's eyes, but Lilith didn't say anything in return. She just sped up to get to the scene as fast as possible. And in the end, it turned out that the surprise Lilith received was a lot bigger than she expected. Second order. That little scoundrel actually managed to evolve while I was away. She watched in amazement as Xietain restrained the massive creature with his attacks, forcing it to retreat deeper and deeper into the ocean. Oh? Does that mean he was a lower existence of the First Order until no more than a few months ago? Fire Sorrow asked with her bright eyes fixed on the magnificent scene before her. Lucifer and Medes at their peak while in the Second Order were definitely not capable of doing what Xietain was doing against the Leviathan. This was not because they were both too weak, quite the contrary, they were so frighteningly powerful that being at level 100 they could fight and even kill level 250 soul evolvers. But level 299? Totally and absolutely impossible. Especially not against a beast with such magical ability and physical body, terrifying enough to survive the impact of several annihilation-level blasts. I wonder how high that child's stats are. Fire Sorrow muttered in awe and growing interest. Seeing Xietain completely overpower a fourth-order beast at the intermediate stage, an especially strong one at that, naturally made Lilith feel incredibly proud and happy just as a wife would for her husband's accomplishments. However, there was also a bit of regret and lament in her eyes. It was true that she was the one who had spent the most amount of time together with Xietain since the apocalypse began for him and all living beings on the planet, but Lilith knew in her heart that she had missed many important and crucial moments in his life. Moments that he was able to share with other people like Shangguan, Bing Shui, and Wu Yijuan. Because no matter how much the two of them ignored the words lower existence, higher existence, the difference was there: levels, order, race, power, types of freedoms, and a lot more. Lilith wondered what kind of difficulties he had experienced to complete these last requirements. How difficult was his battle against that fourth-order enemy? The simple fact of feeling that his two left limbs were actually fake prosthetics made of blood caused the existence known as Bloody Succubus, who changed the course and fate of the war between the demonic army and the Golden Domain, to feel extremely tearful. After that, Fire Sorrow pointed out several things, but Lilith was no longer listening to her. Her beautiful ruby-colored eyes were fixed on her beloved's every move, as if there was nothing else but him in life capable of catching her attention. The two females had arrived when the battle between Xietain and the Leviathan had already begun, and therefore neither of them knew at the time that someone capable of controlling zombies, a 7-year-old human, was now among the ranks of the Transcendent faction. Approximately 40 minutes later, returning to the present, the disbelief felt by Lilith and Fire Sorrow reached such high levels that they probably only got to feel a few times in their lives. Seeing Xietain using Drain Life to support his recovery and regeneration rate did not surprise Lilith that much, since she was fully aware of the existence of such a skill. She had been by his side when he obtained it after all. Fire Sorrow was surprised, as even though Drain Life wasn't a skill as peculiar as the Isis Control Maker manipulation type skills, it was still a very rare skill. But most of her surprise came from the fact that even if Drain Life was a good skill, it still shouldn't be enough to help someone regenerate limbs. This was because Fire Sorrow didn't know about the existence of restoration and wasn't aware of how terrifying Xietan's stats were or what the true effect of overlap regeneration was. But what happened next was the real cherry on top to decorate the cake of amazement. Level 299. Level 298. Level 297. Level 250. Level 201. Level 173. That's... Fire Sorrow's pupils contracted fiercely, and her face turned pale as a sheet. Even Lilith subconsciously took half a step back as she watched the scene in front of her, in utter shock. How could this be possible? How could this be possible? Why? Both Lilith and Fire Sorrow could feel the level of the massive beast in the ocean plummeting ever since Xietain buried his left arm in its forehead. That child has already started to experience racial evolutions? Impossible. He's just in the second order. Fire Sorrow exclaimed and shook her head, with her eyes always fixed on the scene unfolding in the distance. Lilith was just as much in shock as Fire Sorrow, though perhaps a little better. I knew this would happen, but I thought it would be around the third order. Lilith suddenly began to laugh out loud, startling Fire Sorrow. Whatever my little scoundrel is evolved into, it seems that it won't be at all difficult for him to become a higher existence on his own. Fire Sorrow would have denied Lilith's words, as she knew how difficult it was to take that step, but seeing what she was seeing, she simply couldn't do it. That child's race seems to be heading towards the stripping of records? But how can this be possible? Fire Sorrow observed the focused look on Xietan's face, and her eyes glittered slightly. What he is doing is literally the opposite of the soul record. The soul record created and bestowed initial records, pushing evolution. But Xietain was devastating the existing records, and soon they would both realize that he was also able to bestow them to someone different. And this is just him in the second order, Fire Sorrow. Lilith smiled beautifully and pointed with a chest puffed out in pride. Wait for the third and fourth order. I wonder if anyone will be able to stop him by then. Fire Sorrow looked at Lilith in shock before moving her eyes back to Xietain, and for the first time since the establishment of the demonic army, her practically blind faith in the one who led them wavered. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1029 Reunion and Shinjingjing. Xietain naturally had no idea that he was being watched closely, not only by Fire Sorrow, who probably shared a strange relationship with him in case he really was the reincarnation of the heavenly wolf Sirius, but even his beloved little succubus had returned after so many months. Devastating the records of the giant Leviathan was extremely difficult, not only because they were scattered throughout its colossal size, but also because of the fact that the beast was a creature of ancient times that had existed for at least a few million years. Besides, even if Xietain could overwhelm his enemy in combat, it didn't mean that he had the ability to devastate its soul and existence easily. Shit, being limited by my own order of power really is a big pain in the ass. Xietan's sighed, paying no heed to the roars of pain the crazily writhing creature let out. While it was true that choosing difficult paths would eventually lead to a longer travel and thus greater rewards in the process, breaking through the wall that led to that path was troublesome and time-consuming. That was precisely why, regardless of the extremely large number of geniuses that existed and still do, many were only shooting stars in the night sky, sparkling for a second before disappearing forever, as they did not have a firm foundation and those already established did not give them time to grow. Unlike when Xietain used record devastation on Tao Xi, this time it was not so easy in comparison. At that time, Tao Xi was on the verge of death, and his overall strength was much lower than that of the Leviathan. On the other hand, the giant Leviathan was not only more powerful overall and its level much higher, but it still had enough fuel to fight for hours if Xietain were to release it. Fortunately, as the saying went, even the hardest rock of all would eventually be cracked by small drops of water after a long time. 10 minutes later, Xietain used his wings to stay above sea level as he watched in amazement at the large lifeless creature slowly sinking into deep water. The Leviathan had been stripped of its deepest records, but it was still at least 500 meters long. A true monster without a doubt. I wonder if its meat will be at least a little helpful or not. Xietain flew down and after stepping on the body of the sinking beast sent it straight to the collector's pocket world. It was too big for his storage ring. Xietain was also curious about the scales and spines, as well as the teeth of the Leviathan. Even if they were no longer as hard, tough, or sharp as they were before Xietain devastated the creature's records, its entire body was still a treasure capable of being turned into numerous weapons. After a full minute of silence, listening to nothing but the buzzing of the waters and the winds blowing from everywhere, Xietain turned around. I should be getting back. However, he had only flown 100 or 200 meters when his expression changed. Swoosh. A breeze that was many times softer and more delicate than all the others caressed Xietan's face with tenderness and affection like that of a lover caressing their sleeping partner. More importantly, that soft and gentle breeze had something that he could never forget or mistake, even if he was turned to ashes and scattered to the wind. Unfortunately, even after looking around for several seconds like a hopeless madman, Xietain still didn't see the one he was expecting to see. A glint of disappointment shone in his black eyes, and as he slowly closed them he couldn't stop a bitter smile from appearing on his face. Lilith. I wonder how she is now. Maybe I can ask Fire Sorrow about it if she comes back soon. She owes me an answer anyway. Considering that he had been in the collector's pocket world for over 2 months, the amount of time he hadn't seen Lilith was far more than the amount of time she hadn't seen him. He was finally beginning to understand a little of what his little sister Ming-Chi meant that game night when he showed her the power of the collector's pocket watch. The power of the watch was indeed terrifying, but even its wearer could lose their head if he or she wasn't careful. Are you really willing to use such a valuable opportunity as the one I gave you to ask such a petty question just like that? A voice that contained surprise as well as some reluctance and a hint of regret brought Xietain out of his thoughts. He lifted his head and looked ahead, noticing for the first time that at some point someone he hadn't expected to see so soon was standing in the middle of nothing, looking him in the eye with a complicated expression. Fire Sorrow? I thought it would take you at least a week or 2 to come back. Fire Sorrow forced a smile and said softly, let's just say I finished sooner. Xietain tilted his head in confusion, but before he could say anything else his body became stiff. 2 slender arms slipped slyly under his underarms, and soon he was enclosed in a soft but tight embrace at the same time as his bare back felt the caress of the female breasts he was so familiar with that even through the soft silk they were unmistakable. Little rascal, we have only parted twice, but both times we have been reunited with water in the area. Lilith's voice was no more than a whisper in his ears, and he easily noted the longing, the joy, the pride, and the guilt his lover felt so clearly that it seemed as if their spirits had merged, perfectly leaving the other to feel and understand what the other was feeling. Several seconds passed, and during that time the only sound that could be heard was the sound of the wind gusting and the sound of the water swishing back and forth. Fire Sorrow stared into Xietan's eyes, and it wasn't hard for her to notice that although he was actually looking at her, his heart and mind were completely focused on the woman who was hugging him from behind. No, he was still so shocked that he probably hadn't fallen into reality. I see. Fire Sorrow didn't need to cast any magic spells or activate any skills. She also didn't need any more time to find out if Lilith had used her natural charm to affect the young man's mind and heart before her. If the 2 thin lines of crystalline tears falling down his surprised face were not enough, then the fact that he was willing to miss such a great opportunity just to find out how Lilith was doing was more than enough answer for Fire Sorrow to understand that the love Xietain felt for her was not only genuine but also sincere and free of impurities. What's wrong? You missed me so much that you can't help but cry? Lilith teased. Xietain closed his eyes, and with great difficulty managed to say a few words. I don't want to hear that from you while your tears are running down my back. Lilith closed her eyes and said softly, it's moisture from the ocean. I have nothing to do with it. Watching the pair of two pausing just like that as if the world around them had suddenly ceased to exist or matter, Fire Sorrow felt for the first time in her life incredibly uncomfortable. It was a kind of discomfort that came deep from her chest, and for a moment she felt panicked as this was the first time this had ever happened to her. At least that she remembered, because memories of millions of years ago were sometimes too blurry. A few minutes later, Lilith slowly disengaged from Xietain, and he quickly regained his bearings as he remembered that they were not alone at this moment, and that it would probably be better to celebrate and express happiness for the reunion later. Xietain turned and stared at the face of the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life, but unlike 99.9% of men who were lost in her beauty, he looked beyond. You're wounded. He sighed, and a complicated light shone in his eyes. I'm sorry. Lilith exchanged glances with Fire Sorrow before looking at Xietain with hidden bitterness. You really can notice it. I suspected it after I found out that your race evolved, but to think that it's really like that. The difference between Lilith and Xietain was so immense that it would probably be easier to say that a white cloud and mud didn't have that much difference between them. Even yet, he was able to see through it easily, despite the fact that Lilith had tried to hide it. This also confused Lilith and Fire Sorrow, since even if Xietan's original race had changed, it should still be below both of them. However, Lilith and Fire Sorrow were human long before they were demons, and even though their records had been modified, the base was still the same. Therefore, Xietain could sense that base thanks to his race being high human. I'm sorry. He didn't comment on how Lilith knew about it, but apologized again, confusing Lilith greatly. Xietain, what are you apologizing for? However, he simply shook his head and said nothing. Just at that moment, a gust of wind blew from the distance, bringing with it a voice thick with disdain. He's apologizing with you because he's blaming himself since he couldn't protect you. Lilith raised her head slightly, and her eyes sparkled strangely as she looked at Shangguan Bingshui mounted on Little Snow. I see you are still stuck at the same level. Oh well, nothing to be surprised about. At least I have a better understanding of his thoughts and feelings. Better than you do, it seems. Shangguan Bingshui smiled slightly. Heh. Lilith closed her eyes for a moment and shook her head. Xietain looked at Shangguan Bingshui and then at Fire Sorrow, but soon realized that the former did not seem to be aware of the latter's existence. It seems that Fire Sorrow doesn't want Bingshui to know about her. He didn't give the matter much thought since it was none of his business anyway. Shangguan Bingshui shifted her focus back to Xietain and said casually, we managed to secure the aircraft carrier, and although there are 2 warships that were lost, the rest are fine. Xietain nodded and asked in a serious voice, what about the sea beasts and the girl from before? The sea beasts stopped coming out of the ocean and retreated after we killed the 3 Third Order leaders. Feng Hong was poisoned by the blue-ringed octopus, but it seems he somehow managed to get out of that predicament by burning the poison in his blood using his flames. Shangguan Bingshui narrated calmly, before frowning slightly. As for the girl from before, she simply can't speak at all. I'm afraid she might have suffered too much trauma, and in the worst-case scenario she might never speak again. I see. Xietain nodded with a frown before sighing, for now, we'd better get moving. Soon, the group of 5 dashed towards the shore, except that neither Little Snow nor Shangguan Bingshui knew that among them was an unknown higher existence. Back on the grounds of where the prestigious Shanghai University once stood, Xietain looked at the photos one of his men had handed him, and after looking at the last photo and moving on to the short video saved on the hard drive of one of the computers, he couldn't stop his fingers from clenching inward, crumpling the documents a bit in the process. So cruel, he could barely speak through gritted teeth. The photos showed images of the lower floors of the naval base's central building, and there were also some papers detailing some information, including the identity of the girl with the ability to command the zombies. Her name was Shen Jingjing, and this year she would turn 8 in October. Visit and read more novel to help us update chapter quickly. Thank you so much. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1030 Fire Sorrow Senses, Feng Tian Win the Distance. Her name was Shen Jingjing, and this year she would turn 8 in October. Shen Jingjing's father was Shen Feng, commanding general of the Nautical Defense Forces on the southeast coast of the Pacific Ocean. On the day the world changed, Shen Feng had brought his wife and daughter to give them a tour around the base. This was the family's monthly routine, and since little Shen Jingjing loved warships so much, the two adults got a great kick out of seeing her happily hopping back and forth. It was after being bitten by a zombie that Shen Jingjing's father managed to get his wife and daughter to safety on the lower floors, but the man didn't have much time to do more before turning and attacking his wife. Shen Jingjing's mother managed to prevail in the battle against the zombie, but the cost was the total loss of her right arm. And now knowing that the same thing that had happened to her husband would happen to her, and with tears in her eyes, she apologized to her daughter before taking her own life after feeling that she was slowly losing control over herself. Shen Jingjing, who was only 7 years old, had not only seen terrifying bloodthirsty and cruel scenes of humans killing other humans, with gunshots and roars of terror echoing throughout the base, but the girl had also seen her ever-loving father assaulting her mother and her mother trying to defend herself and her young daughter like a lioness. In the video, they could see how time passed, and after 2 days without drinking liquid at all, the desperate Shen Jingjing finally made her move. The girl apologized and sobbed, but the need was greater, and she weakly crawled back to the bodies of her family, from which she had previously tried to get as far away as possible. That day, Shen Jingjing drank blood to quench her thirst, and exactly 1 week later, she finally succumbed to the feeling of hunger that devoured her bones. It was amazing that such a little kid could endure so long without food, but primal survival instincts were always stronger than practically anything else. After 2 months, Shen Jingjing no longer had anything to eat, and although she was afraid to go out, she knew that if she didn't sooner or later she would end up dying. Besides, although she looked almost the same as in the past, leaving aside her dirty clothes and messy hair, the girl's heart was no longer the same after everything she had lived through during the past 2 months. Xietain and the others could see on the video how after opening the door, 2 zombies lunged towards Shen Jingjing, and the girl immediately fell backwards with a panicked expression on her face as she looked at the bloodthirsty expressions on the deformed features of the 2 creatures. But just as the first zombie was about to grab her, Shen Jingjing let out a high-pitched scream with no intention but to express her fear. This was what changed her fate forever. The first zombie stopped, and as if it was following someone's thoughts, it rushed at its companion, and after a fierce battle managed to kill it. It seems that it was at that moment that she became a soul evolver. Shangguan Bingshui sighed as she watched the naive girl reaching forward as if trying to touch a window invisible to the security cameras. Neither Xietain nor any of the people inside the military tent needed to look any longer to understand that it was at that moment that Shen Jingjing's life took a drastic turn. No, her life had changed from the first moment her parents died, and she had no choice but to do what she did for the sake of her survival. A few minutes later, Bai Shilin together with the twins Wen and Luo Ning walked into the tent, and next to the girls was Shen Jingjing. Shen Jingjing had showered using a tank of warm water, so she was now clean and wearing pretty clothes, but the fear in her wide-open eyes was as big as it had been since day one, and the wariness she felt had not decreased even for a moment. "Your name is Shen Jingjing, isn't it?" Xietain tried to use the gentlest and kindest voice he could get out of his soul as he smiled softly. "My name is Xietain. You are very brave. Despite your fear towards those creatures, you fight back and didn't give up, didn't you?" By using the name she had not heard for over a year after being surrounded by strange creatures, introducing himself, and then praising her, Xietain hoped that the girl's wariness would at least lower a little towards him. In fact, when Shen Jingjing looked at him, it became evident that she was not as cautious towards him compared to the others. As to whether this was because of Xietan's wisely chosen words, or whether it was the effect of his high human race, he did not know. Shen Jingjing tried to say something, but quickly closed her mouth and lowered her head to look at the ground. Xietain noticed how the young girl clenched her fists, clearly angry and frustrated at everything that had happened to her. Of course, she lost everything. Her family, her life, even her ability to speak. Everything. Xietain sighed in his heart, but on the outside he kept his smile. "I'll address you as Jingjing, if you don't mind. Is that okay with you?" Naturally, he got no reply. He didn't even get a nod from her. But this was to be expected. "So, Jingjing, if you don't mind, would you want to be part of my team?" The girl raised her head abruptly, and probably as a defense mechanism, took a step back as she looked at everyone warily. Xietain quickly raised both hands and carefully explained, "We are all like you, humans with powers who fight zombies and monsters such as the sea creatures that came out of the ocean earlier." Xietain looked at him silently, and seeing that she was paying attention to his words and understood his meaning, he sighed in relief. The world we knew changed, but our human race did not lose. Xietain said in a serious voice, "China, our country, lost many humans. But after fighting hard for over 1 full year, my team and I managed to regain a large part of the lost land and saved many lives." A normal 7-year-old girl might have problems understanding what Xietain was saying, but to a 7-year-old girl like Xietain, none of his words sounded unfamiliar or weird. "Xietain, let me introduce them to you." Xietain approached cautiously, and although the girl became tense, she did nothing and did not move away. He did not touch her, nor did he stay close for long, but stood next to the 4 girls who had escorted her, and said with a gentle smile, "The little silver-haired girl here is my daughter by Sherlin, and despite her appearance, she is actually only 8 months old from the time she was born. This little girl with the big sword you see here is Luo Ning, she is 11 years old, and the 2 girls with the pigtails are sisters, their names are Wen Yun and Wen Yin, they are both 13 years old." Xietain looked at the 4 girls right as Xietain named them one by one, and after she turned her attention back to him he continued, "They are all around your age, a little more or a little less but very young just like you. And just like you, the 4 of them fight zombies and monsters. They work really hard every day helping adults like me in order to build a safe place for everyone and not let any more families suffer, all of us together." Xietain looked at the 4 girls this time in a slightly different way, and although her wariness and fear were still present for the most part, it was clear that she had relaxed a little. Slowly and carefully, Xietain extended his right hand slightly forward and said softly, "Xietain, would you like to join us? I'm sure the 4 of them, as well as all the adults here, would gladly welcome you. Your power is really amazing, and with your help, we can definitely end this senseless war a lot faster." As Shangguan Bingshui, Sun Ling, Feng Hong, and Liang Jiang stood silently, Xietain stared at Xietan's hand gently stretched forward, and for the first time, her eyes showed something else besides fear and wariness. 10 hours later. Xietain and Shangguan Bingshui, personally monitored as a large human group riding horses, dogs, and even mutant sheep, arrived from the north. These mutant beasts were just unclassified creatures, but using the information Xietain had brought back from Eventide World, several teams of the Transcendent faction caught and managed to control creatures with low combat ability, but good agility and stamina for transportation. Although it was impossible to form soul contracts with these normal beasts since they did not even have basic intelligence, at least this way Xietain would no longer have to worry too much about the eventual disappearance of the petroleum. Soon, great walls over 400 meters high began to rise around the coast, enclosing the warships in what would gradually become the subway of a large military base. "Leader, we have dismantled the aircraft carrier's nuclear missiles." A voice came from the commander's ring, and as Xietain watched the workers setting up tents, preparing food, and sorting through the boxes filled with weapons, he asked slowly, "How many missiles?" 3 missiles in all of them are continental. 3 continental missiles. Xietain nodded slowly. "Feng Hong, make sure the 3 missiles are completely disabled and taken to the launch base in Beijing. Having arrived, there have the missiles reassembled in the free slots." "Roger." A few seconds after the connection with Feng Hong ended, Shangguan Bingshui calmly commented, "It's a pity Xietain didn't join us." "Well, it was to be expected. She's been through a lot and was surrounded only by zombies for over a year and 3 months." Xietain shrugged, "But it's okay, she'll be with us, and when she sees that we really have no bad intentions, she'll eventually stop looking at us with such wariness and terror." After a short pause, Shangguan Bingshui gave him a sidelong glance, before turning her attention back to the front. "You must be very happy now that she's back, am I wrong?" Xietain didn't need someone to clarify who Shangguan Bingshui was talking about, it was too obvious. "For Lilith, it's been about 3 months since we last saw each other, but for me, it's been around 6. He said. "While it's true that right now there is little she can do for me, she was with me when no one else was there. I think it's okay to admit that I've developed a certain dependence on her, and when I don't have her around I feel kind of lost, so yeah, I'm happy. I wonder if anything would have been different right now if back then you and I had been closer during the time we were on campus. That way, she wouldn't have been the only one." She whispered in a voice lower than the faint buzzing of a mosquito. Did you say something? Bai Zemin looked at Shangwan Bingshui in confusion. No. She smiled as she shook her head. By the way, Bai Zemin. About the plant that the third prince of the East Sea used to skip one of the requirements, Shangwan Bingshui was about to say something when she noticed the frown on Bai Zemin's face. Is something wrong? She asked worriedly. Bai Zemin raised his hand gently to ask her to wait a moment and then asked to the empty space in front of him, extremely pure fire-type energy? What are you talking about? Fire Sorrow pointed to the north and said in a serious voice, a few kilometers from here in a northerly direction, there is an extremely hot energy, even hotter than the core of the world itself burning. Don't you know anything about it? Bai Zemin frowned and was about to say that he had no idea when a thought flashed in his mind. Could it be Feng Tianwu? It was then that Bai Zemin realized that with two knowledgeable beings by his side, he could perhaps save the girl who practically threw away her life for her own reasons.